Welcome to Dreamy Tales English. I'm David. Tonight, we have a special story for you. It's called the Paper Lantern Festival of Fenghuang. Deep in the mountains of Hunan Province, where the Wu River winds through limestone cliffs and ancient stilt houses hang over the water like swallows' nests, there's a town called Fenghuang. The name means phoenix in Chinese, and legend says that if you watch the sunset over the river on a clear evening, you can see the town's rooftops glow like a bird preparing to take flight. Every autumn, when the osmanthus blooms fill the air with sweetness and the moon grows full and bright, the town holds its paper lantern festival. For centuries, families have gathered to handcraft paper lanterns from rice paper and bamboo, then set them floating down the river at dusk, each one carrying a wish written on a small piece of silk. Xiao was 26 years old when she returned to Fenghuang for the first time in 7 years. She had left the town to study architecture in Beijing, drawn by the promise of tall buildings and modern skylines. She had spent her career designing glass towers in the city's financial district, where steel and concrete replaced wood and stone, and where the skyline was measured in height rather than in history. But something had begun to change in her. She had started feeling a kind of emptiness, not in her work, which was successful, but in her life. The buildings she designed were beautiful, but they felt cold. The city she lived in was vibrant, but it felt distant. And every evening, as she sat alone in her apartment overlooking the highway, she would sometimes close her eyes and remember the smell of the Wu River at dusk, the sound of bamboo being split in her grandmother's workshop, the warmth of paper lantern light on her face. So she came back, not to stay forever perhaps, but for one autumn, for one festival. Her grandmother, Nai, was still alive and still making lanterns. At 81, her hands were gnarled like the roots of an old tree, but they moved with the same sure rhythm they had always had. When Xiao walked into the workshop that morning, Nai looked up from her workbench and said, without surprise, "You're just in time. The festival is in 3 days. We have much to do." Xiao set down her bag and sat beside the workbench. She picked up a sheet of rice paper and held it to the light. It was thin as a butterfly's wing, translucent and golden. "Tell me how to make one," she said. Nai smiled. "Then sit, watch, and learn." The process was simple in theory, but delicate in practice. First, you took thin strips of bamboo and bent them into rings of different sizes, a wide ring for the bottom, a narrower one for the top, and a series of smaller rings in between. Then you threaded the rings together with fine bamboo splints, creating a framework that rose like a flower bud. Finally, you stretched the rice paper over the frame, smoothing it with your palms until it lay flat and taut, catching the light like a stained glass window. Zhao's first lantern was ugly. The paper tore. The bamboo frame sagged. The lantern looked more like a collapsed umbrella than a bird preparing to fly. Nai did not laugh. She simply took the ruined lantern, tore the paper carefully from the frame, and said again. She did this 3 more times. Each time, the lantern improved. Each time, Nai's hands moved closer to Zhao's, correcting, guiding, teaching. On the second day, Zhao's lanterns began to look like lanterns. On the third morning, she made one that Nai inspected closely and nodded at with a small, satisfied smile. "You have the hands of a builder," Nai said. "But a lantern is not built. It is grown. There is a difference." On the evening of the festival, the town transformed. Hundreds of families emerged from their homes, each carrying a lantern. The streets filled with the soft glow of paper and bamboo, and the air hummed with laughter and the murmur of wishes being whispered onto silk. Xiao carried her best lantern, a tall, elegant one with a lotus pattern pressed into the paper by Nine Eyes' old wooden mold. She had written her wish on a small square of white silk in careful brushstrokes. I want to build places that remember. She joined her grandmother at the riverbank, where hundreds of lanterns were already floating downstream, bobbing gently on the dark water like fallen stars. The moon hung overhead, full and luminous, casting a silver path across the river that led from the town all the way to the horizon. Xiao placed her lantern on the water. It caught the current and began to drift, its golden light reflecting on the surface, growing smaller and smaller as it moved downstream. Nine Eyes stood beside her hand resting lightly on Zhao's shoulder. "Your mother wished for success when she was your age," she said softly, "and she found it. But she also wished in her heart for this moment, for the chance to come home and float a lantern with her daughter and her mother." Xiao looked at her grandmother. "Did she ever?" Nine Eyes shook her head. "She came back to visit, yes, but she never floated a lantern. She was too busy, too proud, too sure that the future was somewhere else." Xiao felt a lump in her throat. She thought of her mother's apartment in Guangzhou, always immaculate, always quiet. She thought of the phone calls that always seemed to end too quickly. She thought of the way her mother's voice had softened when she spoke about the old days in Fenghuang. "I'm glad I'm here," Xiao whispered. Nine Eyes squeezed her shoulder. "So am I." They stood together at the riverbank until the last lantern had drifted out of sight. The sky was clear, the stars were bright, and the Wu River, patient and eternal, carried the wishes of 1,000 families downstream toward the sea. When Xiao returned to Beijing the following week, she did not go back to designing glass towers. She submitted her resignation and opened a small studio in the old part of the city, a studio dedicated to restoring historic buildings, to preserving the wooden stilt houses and stone bridges and paper lantern workshops that had defined her hometown for centuries. She told her colleagues that she had found a new direction, but the truth was simpler. She had learned that the best buildings are not the tallest. They're the ones that hold memory, the ones that remember who built them and who lived in them and what they hoped for. And every autumn, when the osmanthus blooms and the moon grows full, she returned to Fenghuang to float a lantern on the Wu River, carrying the same wish she had written 7 years ago, now written on a different piece of silk in slightly different handwriting. "I remember. Good night and sweet dreams."